I found the letter in a shoebox in my dead sister's closet. 51 letters, every single one addressed to me, every single one postmarked from a base in Vietnam in 1971, every single one opened, read, and never delivered. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the box on the floor, and that's when I saw the last one, the one dated 3 weeks before Daniel came home, the one my sister wrote back to, pretending to be me, telling him I'd fallen in love with someone else. I was 71 years old, standing in a dead woman's closet, finding out my whole life had been a lie someone else told for me. Daniel and I found each other again 50 years later. People online called it the sweetest story of the year. A local news station wanted to do a segment on us, Childhood Sweethearts Reunited. They didn't know the half of it. Because this isn't a story about two old people falling back in love. This is a story about the person who stole 50 years from us on purpose, and what I did the day I found out. Stick around, because what I'm about to tell you gets so much worse before it gets better. Hey, welcome in. If you're new here, I tell true stories, the kind people don't usually talk about out loud. Slow betrayals, quiet manipulations, and the moment, decades later, when the truth finally claws its way to the surface. This one's personal. This one is mine. I need you to stay with me for this whole thing, because the woman who stole this to me and to the man I loved was smart. She was patient. She played a 50-year game, and by the time I understood the rules, she thought she'd already won. If you believe people should be held accountable, even 50 years later, hit subscribe before this story's over, because trust me, this gets so much worse before it gets good. Let's go back to where it started, 1969, a small town, two teenagers who thought they had forever. My name's Margaret. Everybody called me Maggie back then. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew your business before you did. I was the younger daughter in my family. My sister Carol was 3 years older than me, and from the time I can remember, we were compared constantly. Carol was the responsible one. I was the pretty one. Neither of us liked our label, but nobody asked us. I met Daniel Whitfield in the 10th grade. He sat 2 rows behind me in American history, and the first time he spoke to me was to tell me I had a run in my stocking. I was mortified. He just grinned like it was the funniest thing he'd seen all week. By 11th grade, we were inseparable. He'd walk me home from school every day, rain or shine. He'd carry my books, even though I told him I was perfectly capable of carrying my own books. He used to say, "I know you can. I want to." I want you to really sit with how happy I was, because it makes what happens next so much harder to swallow. We used to sit on the hood of his dad's Chevy out by the reservoir and talk about everything. Where we'd live, how many kids we'd have, whether we'd name our first daughter after my grandmother. We were 17 years old, planning a whole life together like it was already guaranteed to us. Here's the first thing I want you to notice, because you'll understand it later. My sister Carol was always around, always just there. She'd find reasons to join us. She'd show up at the diner where Daniel and I had our first date, coincidentally, with her own friends. She'd ask me detailed questions about our relationship, what we talked about, what he said to me, whether he'd said, "I love you" yet. At the time, I thought she was just being a nosy older sister. Looking back now, I know she was collecting information. Daniel and I got engaged the summer after graduation in 1970. He proposed at the reservoir, same spot as always, with a ring he'd saved 4 months of grocery store paychecks to afford. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. My mother cried happy tears. My father shook Daniel's hand like he was already family. And Carol hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe, and she said into my ear, "I'm so happy for you, Maggie. I really am." I believed her. God help me, I believed her completely. 3 months after we got engaged, Daniel got his draft notice. I remember the day like it happened this morning. He came to my door with the letter still in his hand, and he looked like someone who'd aged 5 years walking up my porch steps. We sat on my parents' porch swing, and he held my hand so tight it hurt, and he said, "I'm gonna come back, and when I do, we're getting married the first week I'm home. I don't care about anything else." I promised him I'd write every single day, and I did. Every single day for the 11 months he was stationed overseas, I sat down and wrote Daniel Whitfield a letter. Here's where it gets complicated, because I never once in 11 months got a single letter back. At first, I told myself mail overseas was unreliable. Then I told myself he was busy, that soldiers didn't always have time to write. Then, around month 4, my sister Carol sat me down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and told me she'd heard, through a friend whose brother served with Daniel, that he'd met someone, a nurse, that he'd been seen with her, that maybe I should prepare myself. I didn't believe her at first. I want you to know that. I defended him. I told her she was wrong. But letter after letter went unanswered, and doubt is a slow poison. By month 7, I'd stopped writing every day. By month 9, I'd stopped hoping he'd write back at all. And then, one afternoon in month 10, Carol came to me with a letter in her hand. She said it had come to the house addressed to me, but that she'd read it first because she wanted to protect me from whatever was in it. The letter said Daniel had fallen in love with someone else overseas, that he was sorry, that he thought it was best if I moved on and didn't wait for him anymore. I remember the exact sound I made reading it. It didn't sound like crying, it sounded like something breaking. I want to stop here for a second, because I need you to really feel what this next part cost me. I was 20 years old. I believed the boy I'd loved since I was 15 had thrown me away in a letter. And the person who handed me that letter, who held me while I cried for 3 days straight, who told me, "You deserve so much better than him, Maggie," that person was my own sister. She wasn't comforting me. She was watching her plan work. 6 months later, Daniel came home from Vietnam. I didn't go to see him. I couldn't. I heard through town that he'd asked around about me, where I was, how I was doing, and that people told him I'd moved on already. Neither one of us knew the other was lying there in the wreckage of a story that was never true. I ended up marrying a man named Robert 2 years later. Decent man, good provider. We had 38 years together before he passed of a heart attack in 2009. I loved him in the quiet, settled way you love a life you built instead of a life you dreamed. But some nights, even 50 years later, I'd think about a boy on the hood of a Chevy telling me he wanted to carry my books. Daniel, I'd later learn, married a woman named Susan the following year. They had 2 kids. He was, by every account, a devoted husband and father for 46 years until she passed from cancer in 2019. We built 2 entirely separate lives, raised 2 separate families, buried 2 separate spouses, all because of 11 months of silence neither one of us understood. But what happened next, the day I found that shoebox, I never saw coming. Because Carol didn't just take my letters. She'd been managing this lie for 50 years, and she was about to get caught in the middle of doing it one more time. Let's jump forward. March of last year. My sister Carol passed away suddenly from a stroke at 74 years old. As her only living sibling, I was the one who had to clean out her house. It was supposed to be a simple weekend project, sort through some boxes, call an estate sale company, put the house on the market. I had no idea I was about to unravel 50 years of my own life while going through my dead sister's closet. I found the shoebox on the top shelf, pushed way back behind a stack of old quilts. It was tied shut with a ribbon, which struck me as odd. Who ties a shoebox shut with a ribbon unless there's something inside they wanted kept safe or kept hidden? Inside were 51 envelopes, all addressed to me in Daniel's handwriting, all already opened. My stomach dropped before my brain even caught up to what I was looking at. I sat down right there on Carol's bedroom floor and started reading. Letter after letter, Daniel telling me how much he loved me, how he counted the days, how he'd dream about the reservoir and the porch swing and our wedding. Letter after letter that I never received. Letters that answered every single one I'd sent him, which meant he had been getting my letters. He wasn't ignoring me. He was writing back every time. Someone had been intercepting our mail on both ends. I want you to imagine finding out at 71 years old that the great heartbreak of your life, the wound you carried for 5 decades, never actually happened the way you thought. That the boy who supposedly abandoned you had in fact been begging you to wait for him the entire time. I found the fake breakup letter too, the one Carol had shown me claiming it came from Daniel, except now, sitting on the floor with 51 real letters in my lap, I recognized something I hadn't let myself see in 1971. It wasn't Daniel's handwriting. It was close, it was a decent forgery, but it wasn't his hand. My sister forged a breakup letter from my fiancé to make me believe he didn't want me anymore. I found a small notebook further back in the box, Carol's handwriting, dated across several months in 1971. It was basically a log. Dates she intercepted letters, notes about what lies she told me that week so she could keep her story straight. A line that said, and I am quoting this because I will never forget it as long as I live, "Told M about the nurse again today. She's starting to believe it. Won't be much longer now." I want you to sit with that phrase for a second. Won't be much longer now. Like I was a project, like breaking my heart was a task on a to-do list she was checking off. The last entry in the notebook was dated the week Daniel came home from Vietnam. It said, D home, told him M married someone. He believed it. Over now. Nobody has to know. She had lied to both of us on both ends for nearly a year, and then she buried it in a shoebox and lived the rest of her life like it never happened. I sat on that floor for almost 2 hours. I didn't cry right away. I think I was in shock. My mind kept trying to rearrange 50 years of memory around this new horrifying fact. The sister who held me while I sobbed over Daniel's betrayal was the one who manufactured that betrayal with her own 2 hands. And then I found the why. Tucked into the very bottom of the shoebox was an old photograph. Carol, 17 years old, standing next to Daniel at a school dance in 1969, both of them laughing at something off camera. On the back, in Carol's handwriting, dated 1969, "Best night of my life." My sister had been in love with my fiancé before I ever was. I called an old family friend who still lived in town, a woman named Peggy who'd known both my sister and me since grade school. I asked her point blank if she remembered anything between Carol and Daniel before Daniel and I started dating. Peggy went quiet for a second, and then she said something that turned my stomach. "Maggie, honey, everybody knew Carol had a crush on Daniel Whitfield before you two ever got together. When he asked you out instead of her, she didn't take it well. I always figured that was old news, though. I didn't know she'd have done something like that." My sister spent almost a year of her life systematically destroying my engagement because she wanted the man I was going to marry, and when she couldn't have him, she decided nobody could.
I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment because I think it's important. It wasn't just sadness, it was rage. A rage I didn't know I still had room for at 71 years old. Rage for the 20-year-old version of me who cried for months over a lie. Rage for Daniel, wherever he was, who'd spent 50 years believing I abandoned him. Rage for every birthday, every anniversary, every quiet night wondering what if that Carol had stolen from both of us and then had the audacity to sit across from me at Thanksgiving dinner for the next 5 decades, like nothing happened.
I need to tell you about the second thing I found in that box because this is the part where I stopped being sad and started being furious. Underneath the letters was a folded piece of paper, a rough draft crossed out and rewritten several times of what was clearly Carol practicing her forgery of Daniel's handwriting. She'd practiced. She'd drafted multiple versions of a lie designed to break my heart, revising it like a term paper until she got it convincing enough to fool a heartbroken 20-year-old girl who trusted her completely. I can't believe this. I sat there and said those exact words out loud, alone, in an empty house. I can't believe this. Because some part of me, some naive part I didn't know I still had, kept expecting there to be an innocent explanation, a misunderstanding, anything other than what was staring back at me in black and white. My sister had planned this, not in a moment of jealousy, over months, with drafts, with a logbook to track her own lies. But here's the part that changed everything. Here's the part I hadn't even gotten to yet. Because tucked in the very last envelope, one that was never opened, one Carol apparently never got around to reading before she died, was something that was going to lead me straight back to Daniel Whitfield, and what happened after that I never saw coming. The very last envelope in the box was different from the others. It was newer. The paper wasn't yellowed like the rest. The postmark was from just 2 years ago, 2023, not 1971. Daniel had written me a letter 52 years after the war ended. My hands were shaking so badly I tore the envelope trying to open it. Inside was a short note, only about half a page, and I have it memorized because I've read it probably 200 times since that day. It said, "Maggie, I don't know if this will even reach you or if you'll want it to. I heard through a mutual friend that Robert passed a few years back, and I'm sorry for your loss. My Susan passed in 2019. I think about you more than I probably should for a married man's memory, except I'm not married anymore, and neither, I think, are you. I don't know what happened between us all those years ago, I never understood it, but I'm 72 years old and I'd like to buy you a cup of coffee before one of us runs out of time to ask. If you don't want to, I understand, and I won't write again. Daniel." He'd sent it to Carol's address, an old address he must have found through a mutual friend, not realizing Carol and I hadn't lived at the same address in decades, except somehow it reached her anyway, likely forwarded by someone who assumed it was for the Whitfield-adjacent family still in that house. Carol had received a letter from Daniel addressed to me, asking to see me again, and she'd hidden that one too. 2 years. She sat on that letter for 2 years, knowing exactly what it was, knowing exactly what she was doing right up until the day she died. That's when something in me went cold and clear, not sad anymore, focused. Because my sister was gone, I couldn't confront her, couldn't ask her why, couldn't demand she explain 50 years of theft to my face. She'd taken that from me too, dying before I ever found the truth. But Daniel was still alive, and he was still waiting for an answer he never got. I want to be clear about something before I keep going. My revenge in this story was never going to be against a dead woman. You can't punish someone who's already gone. What I decided to do instead was make sure the truth outlived her, and that the people who'd spent decades believing a comfortable version of Carol got to see who she actually was. That became my plan, not to hurt anyone, to simply stop protecting a lie. Step 1 was finding Daniel. I hadn't spoken to him in 52 years. I didn't even know if he still lived in the same state. I called Peggy back and asked if she had any way to reach him, and she gave me the number of his daughter, a woman named Karen, who she'd stayed loosely in touch with through church. I sat with that phone number for 2 full days before I could make myself dial it. I kept rehearsing what I'd say to a stranger, Daniel's own daughter, explaining that I was the fiancé her father had before her mother, and that I'd just found out our whole relationship had been sabotaged by my dead sister. When I finally called, Karen picked up on the 3rd ring. I introduced myself, and there was a long silence on the other end. Then she said quietly, "You're Maggie. My dad talks about you sometimes. He always wondered what happened." I told her everything. The shoebox, the letters, the forged breakup note, the unopened letter from 2 years ago that my sister had buried and never told me about. Karen was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I'll never forget. She said, "My dad wrote that letter after my mom passed. He told me about it, said he probably wouldn't hear back, and that was okay, he just needed to try. He's been waiting 2 years for an answer he assumed meant no. He thought my silence was a rejection. He'd spent 2 more years believing I simply didn't want to see him, when the truth was, I never knew he'd asked." I asked Karen if she thought her father would want to hear from me directly. She said, "Ma'am, I think you should call him right now, before either one of you loses 1 more day." I called Daniel Whitfield that same afternoon, and I need to tell you, what happened on that phone call is the moment everything in this story changed. But before I get there, I have to tell you about the plan I built around it, because finding Daniel again was only half of what I needed to do. The other half was making sure my sister's 50-year lie didn't just quietly disappear along with her. Daniel picked up on the 2nd ring. His voice was older, rougher around the edges, but unmistakably his. He said, "Hello?" and I couldn't get a single word out for what felt like 10 full seconds. Finally, I said, "Daniel, it's Maggie." He didn't say anything for a moment either. Then he said so quietly I almost didn't hear it, "I've been waiting 50 years to hear you say that again." I told him everything right there on that first call, because I couldn't stand the idea of him thinking for 1 more minute that I'd chosen to leave him. I told him about the shoebox, about the forged letter, about Carol's notebook, her own confession written in her own hand, tracking her own lies like a grocery list. There was a long silence after I finished, and then Daniel said something that broke me all over again, but in a different way this time. He said, "I wrote you 51 letters, and I thought you never wrote back once. I used to lay in that bunk overseas, wondering what I'd done wrong. I came home and heard you'd already moved on, and I believed it, because why wouldn't I? Nobody tells you the person lying to you might be someone you trust with your whole heart." We talked for almost 4 hours that first call, about everything. About the reservoir, about the porch swing, about Robert and Susan, about our kids and grandkids, about everything we missed and everything we still somehow remembered like it happened last week. Before we hung up, Daniel asked if he could come see me. Not call, come see me in person. He said, "I already lost 50 years waiting on a phone call that never should have needed to happen in the first place. I'm not doing this over the phone for 1 more minute than I have to." I said yes before he even finished asking. Now, here's where the plan part of this story really begins, because I want to be honest with you. My first instinct was simply relief, joy even. I'd found Daniel again, and none of it was because he stopped loving me. But underneath that joy was something harder, something that kept me up at night for weeks. My sister had done this, on purpose, for 50 years, and she'd let our entire family believe she was the person who comforted me through heartbreak, when she was the one who manufactured it. I couldn't confront Carol. She was gone. But I could make sure her 50-year performance didn't get to stay intact after death, the way she clearly intended it to. So here's what I did. First, I had the letters authenticated. I know that sounds extreme, but I wanted there to be no room for anyone in my family to say I was misremembering or exaggerating an old grudge. I brought the letters, the notebook, and the forged breakup note to a document examiner a lawyer friend recommended, and I paid to have the handwriting formally compared. The report confirmed what I already knew. The 51 letters were consistent with Daniel's handwriting on file from military records. The breakup note was not. It was a close but imperfect forgery, and the examiner noted specific inconsistencies in letter formation that matched samples of Carol's handwriting from other documents in her estate. I now had a professional, documented report proving my sister forged a letter to sabotage my engagement in 1971. Second, I reached out to my sister's 3 adult children, my niece and 2 nephews, because I felt they deserved to know the truth about their mother, even though I understood it would be devastating for them. I didn't do this to hurt them. I did it because Carol had spent decades letting her children believe a version of her that wasn't true, and I refused to be the one who kept protecting that lie after everything she'd taken from me. I invited them, along with a few extended family members, to a family meeting at my house. I told them it was important and that it involved their mother, and I asked them all to come in person. Third, and this is the part where I'll admit my hands were shaking as I did it, I contacted the local newspaper. Not out of spite, a young reporter had actually reached out to me months earlier, before I even found the shoebox, after hearing through a church group that Daniel and I had reconnected after 50 years. She wanted to do a sweet reunion human interest piece. I'd originally told her I wasn't interested. Now I called her back and told her I was ready to talk, but I wanted to tell the whole story, not just the pretty part. I told her people need to understand that not every 50-year love story is just a sweet accident. Sometimes it's 50 years of someone else's lie finally running out of road. I had the family meeting scheduled. I had the reporter ready. I had the documents authenticated and sitting in a folder on my kitchen table. And I had Daniel, 72 years old, driving 6 hours across 2 state lines to see me for the first time in half a century. What I didn't expect was what would happen the moment he walked through my front door, and I definitely didn't expect what my niece would tell me at that family meeting 3 days later, something that would make this whole story so much worse than even I understood. Daniel arrived on a Saturday afternoon in April. I'd changed my outfit 4 times that morning like I was 17 years old again, which frankly I found a little embarrassing at 71. When his car pulled into my driveway, I stood on my porch and watched a 72-year-old man get out of the driver's seat slower than he used to, hair fully gray, walking with a slight limp from a knee replacement, and somehow he looked exactly like the boy who used to carry my books. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and just looked at me for a second. Then he said, "You kept the porch light on, just like your mother used to." I don't remember deciding to cry, I just remember that I was. He walked up those steps slow, and when he reached the top, he didn't say anything else. He just wrapped his arms around me the way he used to at the reservoir, and I felt 50 years fold up like they'd never happened at all. We sat on my porch swing, an actual porch swing, which felt almost too perfect, and talked until the sun went down. He told me about his kids, his grandkids, the contracting business he'd built and eventually handed off to his son. I told him about my 38 years with Robert, about my own 2 children, about the quiet, good life I'd built without him. And then, gently, he asked the question I knew was coming. "What made you finally call me, Maggie, after all this time?" I told him about the shoebox. I watched his face change as I explained it, the letters, the forged note, the notebook logging her own lies, the letter from 2 years ago that Carol sat on until the day she died. I watched 50 years of quiet grief on his face turn into something sharper, something that looked a lot like the rage I'd been carrying myself. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, very slowly, "Your sister took 50 years from both of us, and I sat at your family's Thanksgiving table plenty of times before Susan and I got married, back when I still hoped you'd come around. Your sister sat right there with me, talked to me like a friend. The whole time she knew exactly what she'd done." That's when Daniel said something I hadn't even considered yet. He said, "Maggie, I think I need to be there when you tell your family the truth. I think they need to hear it from both of us." I agreed, and 3 days later, when my sister's children sat down in my living room expecting a conversation about closing out their mother's estate, Daniel Whitfield sat right there next to me. And what my niece said when she heard the truth was something I never, ever expected. The family meeting happened on a Tuesday evening. My niece, Renee, and my 2 nephews, Mark and Stephen, all came, along with a couple of cousins who'd asked to be there once they heard it involved something important about Aunt Carol.
I'd laid the documents out on my dining room table before anyone arrived. The 51 original letters, the forged breakup note, Carol's handwritten log, the document examiner's report, and the recent letter from Daniel that had sat unopened for 2 years. Daniel sat next to me. I introduced him properly for the first time to most of them, not as an old friend, but as the man I was supposed to marry in 1971, before their mother made sure that never happened. Renee looked confused at first. She said, "Aunt Maggie, I don't understand. Mom used to tell us about how you got your heart broken by some soldier who found someone else overseas. She always said it so sadly, like she felt so bad for you." I slid the folder across the table. I watched 3 adults, Carol's own children, read through their mother's handwriting confessing to a 50-year lie. I watched Renee's hands start shaking around page 3. I watched Mark go completely silent, staring at the same line over and over. Told Em about the nurse again today. She's starting to believe it. Renee finally looked up and there were tears streaming down her face, but not the kind of tears I expected. She said, "This isn't just about you and Daniel, is it? This is about the way she talked about her whole life. She always acted like she was the one who held the family together, like she was the reasonable one who took care of everybody." Then she said something that hit me harder than anything else that entire night. She said, "Aunt Maggie, I think I need to tell you something too." Renee took a shaky breath and told us that 2 years ago, around the same time Daniel's letter had arrived and disappeared into that shoebox, she remembered her mother acting strange for a few weeks, secretive. Carol had told her family she was dealing with some old paperwork and didn't want to be disturbed. Renee said, "I remember asking her about it and she just said, 'Some things are better left buried, honey.' I thought she meant like old bills or something. I didn't think—" She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Carol had known in that moment 2 years ago exactly what she was doing when she buried Daniel's letter. She wasn't confused or forgetful or overwhelmed. She made an active, conscious decision at 72 years old, decades after the original lie, to bury one more piece of the truth, and she said it out loud to her own daughter without a shred of guilt in her voice. "Some things are better left buried, honey." I want you to imagine sitting in that room and hearing that, because it meant this wasn't a story about a 19-year-old girl who made one terrible mistake and then had to live with it quietly for the rest of her life, telling herself it was in the past. This was a woman who, as recently as 2 years before her death, chose, again, to keep this lie alive, rather than let 2 elderly, widowed people find happiness in whatever time they had left. Stephen, my other nephew, was the first one to say what everyone was thinking. He looked at me and said, "Aunt Maggie, I am so sorry. I don't even know what to say to you right now."
I told them all the same thing. I told them I wasn't there to punish them for their mother's choices. I wasn't there to demand an apology on her behalf, because a person can't apologize from the grave, and it wouldn't have meant anything even if they'd tried to give one for her.
I told them I was there because I refused to let their mother's carefully managed reputation survive intact when the truth existed in a shoebox in her own closet. Renee asked me through tears what I wanted from them, and I told her the truth. I didn't want money, I didn't want to erase Carol from the family history, or demand anyone stop grieving her. I just wanted the truth to exist in the open, the way it should have 50 years ago, instead of buried in a shoebox with a ribbon tied around it. That family meeting wasn't the end of it, though, because 3 weeks later the newspaper piece ran, and it wasn't the sweet reunion story the reporter originally planned to write. And the response to that article was something none of us, not me, not Daniel, not even Carol's own children, ever saw coming. The reporter, whose name was Jenna, sat with me for almost 3 hours the week after that family meeting. I gave her everything: the letters, the forged note, the document examiner's report, Carol's own handwritten confession in that notebook. I told her about Daniel's unopened letter and about what Renee had told us at the table. I made one request. I asked her to focus on the truth, not on villainizing a dead woman for cheap shock value. I told her, my sister is gone. I'm not trying to burn her memory to the ground for entertainment. I want people to understand what jealousy left unchecked can actually cost 2 people for 50 years. The article ran under the headline, 50 Years Stolen: How One Sister's Secret Kept 2 Sweethearts Apart for Half a Century, and What Happened When the Truth Finally Came Out. It included photos of the original letters, a photo of Daniel and me on my porch swing 60 years after we first sat there as teenagers, and it included, with Renee's permission, a quote from her. My mother taught me that family means honesty. Finding out she spent 50 years doing the opposite has changed how I think about everything she ever told me. The story went further than any of us expected. A regional news station picked it up. Then a national daytime talk show reached out, wanting Daniel and me to come on and tell our story. We said yes, not for the attention, but because by that point I understood something important. Our story wasn't just about us anymore. Letters started coming in from viewers, dozens of them, people who'd found out, sometimes decades later, that a family member had intercepted mail, spread lies, or manipulated a relationship out of jealousy or control. One woman wrote that her own mother had done something almost identical to her in the 1980s, and reading our story gave her the courage to finally confront her about it before it was too late. That's when I finally understood what satisfying revenge actually looked like in this situation. It wasn't about punishing Carol. She was already gone, and nothing I did could reach her anymore. The real justice was making sure her lie didn't get the last word, making sure the truth outlived her manipulation, and making sure other people recognized the same pattern in their own families before it cost them 50 years, too. I'll admit there was one moment, though, that felt like pure, uncomplicated vindication. It was small, but it mattered to me more than almost anything else in this whole story. A cousin of mine, someone who'd always been closer to Carol, who used to say things like, "Carol's always been the glue holding this family together," called me in tears after reading the article. She said, "Maggie, I owe you an apology. I spent 40 years thinking you were the dramatic one in this family, always a little too sensitive about old history. I had no idea. I am so sorry I ever made you feel like your grief wasn't valid." I think that's the moment most viewers watching this would scream "yes" at their screen.
Because for 50 years, I was the one people quietly judged for still being hung up on an old high school romance. I was the one people thought needed to let it go already. And it turned out the entire time, I wasn't holding on to something irrational. I was holding on to the one true thing in a story everyone else had been lied to about, too. Here's the twist I genuinely did not see coming, and it happened almost 2 months after the article ran. A woman named Dorothy contacted me through the newspaper. She said she'd grown up 2 houses down from my family back in the 60s and 70s, and that she remembered something from that era she thought I should know. She told me that back in 1971, while Daniel was still overseas, she'd once overheard Carol on the phone with someone, laughing about how easy it was to convince me Daniel had moved on. Dorothy said she'd been young herself at the time, maybe 14, and didn't fully understand what she'd overheard. She just remembered feeling uneasy about it and mentioning it to her own mother, who told her, "That's grown folks' business, stay out of it." Dorothy said the guilt of staying quiet had bothered her on and off for 50 years, and reading our story finally gave her a reason to say something. What struck me wasn't the new information itself. By that point, I already had all the proof I needed. What struck me was realizing how many people, in small ways, over 5 decades, had brushed up against this lie and let it slide, assuming it wasn't their business, assuming someone else would say something eventually. It made me even more certain I'd done the right thing bringing it into the light. Silence is how lies like this survive for 50 years in the first place. I wrote Dorothy back and told her she had nothing to apologize for. She was 14 years old, and the adults around her told her to mind her own business. The responsibility for 50 years of stolen time belonged to exactly one person, and that person was gone now, and there was nothing productive in spreading blame to a scared teenager from half a century ago. I want to tell you what payoff actually looked like in this story, because it wasn't a courtroom and it wasn't a dramatic public confrontation. My sister was already gone. There was no version of this where she faced consequences the way a living person would. The payoff was this: the truth survived her. Her children now know who she really was, not to hate her necessarily, because grief and love and anger can all exist in the same heart at once, but to understand her honestly instead of through the carefully polished version she'd spent 50 years maintaining. Renee told me a few weeks later that she'd started going through some of her own mother's old journals with new eyes and found 2 more instances of Carol manipulating situations in the family for her own benefit. Smaller things, nothing as devastating as what happened to me, but enough to confirm this wasn't a single moment of jealousy, it was a pattern. The payoff was also this: dozens of strangers across the country recognized similar patterns in their own families because our story finally said the quiet part out loud. And the payoff? The biggest one, the one that actually matters most to me. Daniel Whitfield asked me to marry him on the same reservoir where he proposed the first time, 53 years after his first proposal. He got down on one knee, slower than he used to, knee replacement and all, and he said, "Maggie, I've loved you since I was 16 years old and you had a run in your stocking. Somebody stole 50 years from us, and I am not giving them one single day more. Will you marry me?" I said yes before he even finished the sentence, just like the first time. We got married 4 months later in a small ceremony at that same reservoir, surrounded by both of our children, our grandchildren, and, surprisingly, most of Carol's children, including Renee, who stood up during the reception and gave a toast that made the entire room cry. She said, "My mother spent her life trying to control everyone else's story. Today, we're here to celebrate the fact that the truth always finds its way home eventually, even if it takes 50 years. That, to me, is what real justice looked like in a story where the person responsible was already gone. Not punishment, restoration. Daniel and I got the ending we were always supposed to have, just 50 years later than we deserved it, and this time nobody's secret was standing in the way. I think about those 51 letters almost every single day now. Daniel and I keep them in a glass display box in our living room, not to dwell on what was stolen from us, but as a reminder of what we got back. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this story, it's this. Jealousy that goes unchecked doesn't stay small. It doesn't stay contained to one bad decision in one difficult year. Left alone, it can quietly reshape 50 years of two people's lives, and the person responsible can go their entire life being called the reasonable one, the one who held the family together, while the truth sits folded up in a shoebox in a closet nobody ever opens. I don't regret exposing the truth, even though it meant disrupting how my sister's own children remembered her, because the alternative was letting a lie win permanently, forever, and I had already given it 50 years. That was enough. Daniel and I are 72 and 71 years old now, and some days it still feels surreal to wake up next to him. We don't get to have the 50 years we were supposed to have together. We can't get those back, but we get whatever time is left, and neither one of us is willing to waste one single day of it pretending we don't know exactly how precious that time is. So here's my question for you, and I really want to know the answer. If you found out someone in your own family had done something like this, even decades later, even if they were already gone, would you have exposed the truth, or would you have let it stay buried for the sake of peace? Comment below and tell me what you would have done. I read every single one. And if this story meant something to you, hit subscribe because I've got so many more of these. Real stories, real people, real consequences. 50 years in the making sometimes. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you in the next story.